Chapter 36. Whither are we going? We are carried along with an inconceivable rapidity. The night has been appalling. The storm gives no sign of abating. We live in an atmosphere of deafening sound, a ceaseless thunder. Our ears are bleeding. We cannot hear each other speak. The lightning is incessant. I see flashes which describe a kind of backward zigzag, and, after a rapid course, seem to return upward as if they would arrive in the granite vault above us. If that vault should be rent, what would become of us? Sometimes the lightning is forked, and sometimes it takes the form of fiery globes, which explode like so many bombshells, whose report is amid the roar of elements. The human ear can no longer measure the increment of sound. If all the powder magazines in the world were to blow up, I believe we should fail to perceive the shock. The surface of the clouds is constantly emitting scintillations of electric light. Their molecules seem continually to disengage electricity. The air seems parched, and countless jets of water are thrown up into the atmosphere and fall in foam. Again, I ask myself, whither are we tending? My uncle lies stretched at full length on the raft. The heat increases. On consulting the thermometer, I find it marks. The figures are effaced. Monday, August 24th. The storm has not yet ceased. It seems strange that after any modification in the dense atmosphere, there has not come some definitive change. We are broken down with fatigue. Hans is much as usual. The raft keeps driving to the southeast. We have already made more than 600 miles since leaving Axel Island. At midday, the hurricane acquired tenfold force. We were obliged to make very fast article of cargo, and also to lash ourselves out to the raft. The sea was washing over us. For 3 whole days, we had been unable to exchange a syllable. Even a word shouted in the car was inaudible. My uncle leaned over to me and said something. I fancied it was, "We are lost." I am not certain. It occurred to me to write the words, "Let us take in our sail." He nodded assent. He had scarcely raised his head again, when a fiery disk appeared on the edge of the raft. The mast of the sail were swept away together, and I saw them flying an immense distance above, looking like a pterodactyl, a primeval bird whom geologists tell us. We were petrified with fear. The great ball, half fiery white, half azure blue, the size of a 10-inch shell, moved slowly, spinning with great velocity, and it was now here, now there, up on the timbers of the raft, over the bag of provisions. Then it glanced lightly down, made a bound, grazed the case of gunpowder. Horror! We shall be blown into atoms! No! The dazzling disk retreated and approached Hans, who stared calmly at it. Then my uncle, who crouched on his knees to avoid it. Then myself, pale and shuddering at the glare of the glow. It gyrated close to my foot, which I was powerless to withdraw. An odor of nitrous gas filled the air. It attacked the throat and lungs. We were all but suffocated. What can it be that hinders me from moving my foot? It feels as if riveted to the raft. I have it! The contact of this electric body has magnetized all the iron in our board. Our tools, our firearms, and were stirred, clicking as they touched each other. The nails of my boots had forcibly adhered to the plate of the iron sunk to the timber. I can not stir my foot. At length, by violent effort, I succeeded in tearing it away. Just as the bell was preparing to strike me in its next gyration. Oh, what intensity of light! The ball bursts. We are covered in jets of flame. Then all is dark. I had just one time to discern my uncle stretched out on the raft, Hans motionless at the tiller and spitting fire under the influence of electricity which pervaded his body. Again I exclaim, "Where are we going?" Tuesday, August 25th. I had just recovered from a prolonged swoon. The lightnings are let loose in the atmosphere like a brood of serpents. Are we still at sea? Yes, driving on incredible swiftness. We have passed under England, under the British Channel, under France, perhaps under all of Europe. But a new sound greets our ears. Surely the roar of breakers. But in that case... Chapter 37. Here ends what I call my journal on board, which fortunately has been saved from the wreck. I take up my narrative as before. What happened as the raft struck on the rocks I can scarcely tell. I felt that I was thrown among the breakers, and if I escaped death, if my body was not mangled by the pointed rocks, I was the strong arm of Hans that plucked me from the waters. The courageous Icelander carried me beyond the reach of the waves, and laid me on a burning sandy shore, where I found myself side by side with my uncle. Then he returned to the rocks, where the angry sea was dashing. In order to try to save some waves from the wreck, I could not speak. I was worn with excitement and fatigue. It was more than an hour before I recovered my faculties. Even at this time of deluge of rain was falling, but that accumulated force that betokens the end of the storm. Some rocks piled on others afforded us a shelter from the torrent. Hans prepared some food which I could not torch, and then, exhausted by our 3 nights' watch, we fell into a troubled sleep. Next day, the weather was glorious. Sky and sea united in soft repose. All trace of the tempest was dissipated. Such was the joyful news with which the professor greeted me on awaking. His gaiety jarred on my nerves. "Well, my lad," he said, "I hope you slept well." He spoke as if we were at home in Königstrasse, and in that I had just come down to breakfast on my wedding morning with poor Grauben. Alas, if the storm has only impelled the raft to the eastward, we should have passed under Germany, under my beloved town of Hamburg, perhaps under the very street where dwells all that is dearest to me in the world. Then there would only have been 120 miles between us, but 120 vertical miles through a granite wall, in reality where there had more than 3,000 miles to travel. All these melancholy thoughts flashed through my mind before I repelled to my uncle's question. "Well," he said, "I asked how you slept." "Very well," I said. "I am knocked up, but that is nothing. Nothing at all, merely a little fatigue." "You seem in great spirits this morning, uncle," I said. "Delighted, my lad, delighted. We have arrived." "At the end of our expedition?" "No, but at the end of the weary sea. We shall now resume our land journey, and this time we shall penetrate the bowels of the earth." "But, uncle, may I ask you a question?" "You may ask, Axel." "How will we get back?" "Get back? Is your mind on getting back before we have even arrived to our journey's end?" "No, I merely wanted to know how it will all be accomplished." "The simplest thing in the world. Once arrived at the center of the spheroid, we shall discover a new route whereby to regain the surface, or else we shall return in a commonplace manner by the same road by which we came. It would not be closed behind us. That was the one comfort. In that case, the raft must be made tight, of course. But we have provision for all this traveling?" "We have. Hans is a right clever fellow, and I am sure he has saved us the greatest part of our cargo. However, come and let us see." The windy grotto. I had hope, which was almost fear. It seemed to me impossible that anything on board the raft could have survived that terrible landing. I was wrong. When I reached the beach, Hans was in the midst of the mass array of objects arranged in order. My uncle pressed his hand with the liveliest of gratitude. This man, whose superhuman devotion is probably without parallel, had toiled while we slept, and had saved all that was most precious to us, at the risk of his own life. Not that we had not serious losses. our firearms, for example, but those we could do without. The powder was uninjured, having missed explosion during the storm. Well, exclaimed the professor, as the guns are gone, we cannot expect to go hunting. That is something. That is all very well, I said. But what of our instruments? Here's the mamometer, the most useful of all, for which I have given all the rest. Having that, I can calculate our depth, and it is certain that when we are at the center, without we should run the risk of coming out of the antipodes. His joking manner appeared to me ferocious. And the compass, I said? Here it is on the rock, quite unharmed, and the chronometer and the thermometer. Oh, the hunter is an invaluable fellow. This could not be gainsaid. Not one of our instruments was missing. As tools, as implements, I saw scattered on the sand, ropes, ladders, pickaxes, and mattocks, etc. There was only remained the victualling questions. And the provisions, I said. Aye, let me see the provisions, said my uncle. The cases which contained them were lying in a row in the perfect state of preservation. The sea had spared them for the most part, and taking everything together, biscuit, salt, meat, Geneva, and dried fish, we had sufficient for 4 months. 4 months, cried the professor. Why, we have enough to go and come back, and with what is left, I will give a grand dinner to my colleagues in Jonaham. I ought to have been used to my uncle's eccentricities and by this time, but they still never cease to surprise me. Now, he said, we can replenish our water stores from the granite basin which the storm has filled with rain, so we are no longer in danger of suffering from thirst. As to the raft, I should recommend Hans make the best job he can of it, although I do not expect to want it again. Why not? I said. A fancy of mine, my boy. I do not think we shall come out the way where we came in. I looked at the professor with a great misgiving. I wondered if he had gone crazed, but he spoke quite collectedly. Let us go to breakfast, he said. I followed him to a high promontory after he had given directions to the hunter. There, dried meat, biscuit, and tea had made up an excellent meal, one of the best I had ever made in my life. Fasting, the fresh air, and rest following strong excitement all combined to give me an appetite. During breakfast, I questioned my uncle as to the means of ascertaining where we were at this moment. That, I said, seems to me very difficult to calculate. Well, yes, to calculate exactly, he answered. In fact, it would be impossible, because during the 3-day storm, I could take no note of rate or direction of our course. But still, by reckoning, we can estimate our position approximately. Our last observation was taken at the Geyser Island. At Axel Island, my lad. Do not decline the honor of giving your name to the first island discovered in the center of the earth. Be it so. At Axel Island, we had crossed 810 miles of sea. We were more than 1,800 miles from Iceland. Just so, before starting from that point, let us reckon 4 days of storm, during which our speed was certainly not less than 240 miles in the 24 hours. I think that is about it, so that we will add 900 miles to add. Yes, the Sea of Lindenbrock must be 1,800 miles across. Do you know, Axel, it will rival the Mediterranean. Yes, especially if we have only crossed the breadth, which was quite possible. Another curious thing, I said. If our calculations are correct, the Mediterranean must be right over our heads. Really? Yes. We are 2,700 miles from Reykjavik. That is a good step from here, my lad. But whether we are under the Mediterranean rather than under Turkey or under the Atlantic, we cannot decide unless we are sure that we have not deviated from our course. Well, it is easy to ascertain by looking at the compass. Let us go and see. The professor made the rock on which Hans had arranged the instruments. It was lively slightly. Rubbed in hands, threw himself into attitudes as we went. He was young again. I followed him, anxious to know if my calculations were correct. Arrived at the rock, my uncle took up the compass, laid it horizontally, and watched the needle, which, after a few oscillations, settled itself into its place. My uncle gazed, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. Then he turned to me and bewildered the air. "What ails you, uncle?" He motioned me to look at the instrument. I uttered an exclamation of astonishment. The needle indicated north, where we had believed the south to be. It turned to the shore instead of to the open sea. I shook the compass. I examined it. It was in good order. No matter which way I turned, it persisted in making this unexpected declaration. We could only conclude that during the tempest we had failed to note the change in the wind which had brought us back to the raft on the shore, which my uncle had hoped he had left behind him. Chapter 38. No words could depict the succession of emotions which agitated the professor. Bewilderment, incredulity, rage. I never saw a man so discomforted at first or so enraged afterwards. After all the fatigues of the journey, all the risk we had to run, all must be done over again. We had gone back instead of forward. My uncle soon recovered himself. "What a trick fate has played me! The very elements are against me. The air, the fire, the water conspire to bar my passage. Well, they shall know what they can accomplish. I will not yield. I will not go back a step. And we shall see whether man or nature will win." Standing upright on the rock, and betraying his irritation by his menacing attitude, Otto Lindenbrock reminded me of Ajax defying the gods. I thought it time to interpose and put a check on his mad enthusiasm. "Listen to me, uncle," I said in a steadfast voice. "There is a limit to human ambition. It is useless to struggle after the impossible. We are badly equipped for a sea voyage. 15,000 miles cannot be done on a raft of unsound timbers, with a rag of blankets for a sail, a stick of mast, and the face of the winds of heaven let loose. We have no means of steering. We are the plaything of the storm, and it is the height of the madness to attempt the voyage a second time." I set forth this without interruption for about 10 minutes, but this was owing slowly to inattention of the professor, who did not hear one word of my arguments. "To the raft!" That was his answer. In vain I entreated him to desist. In vain I stormed. In vain I spent my strength in warring against a will harder than granite. Hans had just completed the repairs of the raft. It was as if this whimsical being had divined my uncle's plans. With some pieces of Surtur brand, he had just strengthened the vessel. The sail was already spread and flapping in the breeze. The professor gave a few instructions to the guide, who immediately put our belongings on board and made everything ready for a start. The water was pretty clear, and the northeast wind held. What could I do? How could I alone make a head against these two? Impossible, even if Hans sided with me. But the Icelander seemed to have put away all individual will and taken a vow of abnegation. I could do nothing with the servant so enslaved to his master. That was nothing for it but to go on. Accordingly, I proceeded to take my usual place to the raft, when my uncle put out his hand to stop me. "We shall not start till tomorrow," he said. I made a gesture of resignation to everything that might be in store for me. "I must omit nothing," he said. "Since fate has thrown me on this part of the coast, I will not leave it without a full examination. This remark will be intelligible when it is understood that we have returned to the north coast, but not to the part from which we had started. Port Gräuben must be more to the west, so that, after all, was nothing unreasonable in the professor's desire to explore carefully which new region. "Let us go and reconnoiter," I said, and leaving Hans to his occupations, we set out. The space between the beach and the foot of the sea rampart was very expensive. We walked for a good half-hour before reaching the rocky wall. Our feet crushed innumerable shells of every form and size, the former homes of extinct species. I also observed countless numbers of carapaces whose diameter often exceeded 15 feet. They had belonged to those giant glyptodons of the Holocene period, of which the tortoise of our day is but a miniature copy. The ground was also strewn with an immense quantity of rocky debris, a sort of pebbles rounded by the action of water and arranged in successive rigid lines. I judged from this that the sea had at some time occupied this space. On the scattered rocks, now and out of their reach, the billows had left evident traces of their passage. This might account in some degree for the existence of an ocean 120 miles below the surface of the earth. But according to my theory, this liquid mass must be little by little lose itself in the bowels of the earth, and it is evidently replenished from the waters of the ocean which find their way through some fissure. Just now, however, the fissure must be closed. Otherwise, this cavern, or rather this immense reservoir, would be filled in a very short time. Or perhaps this body of water struggling against the subterranean fires may partly vaporize, which would account for the clouds suspended overhead, and for the electric disturbances and convulses the interior globe. This seemed to me an adequate theory of phenomena we ourselves had witnessed. For however the vast wonders of nature, they are always referable to the physical causes. We were walking on a kind of sedimentary stratum, formed by water, like all the strata of the period, so widely distributed over the earth. The professor pored attentively into every chink of the rock. He was convinced that some opening must exist, and it was vital to him to ascertain its depth. We had followed the coast of the Sea of Lindenbrock for a mile, and when suddenly the surface exhibited the change, it seemed to have been turned upside down, torn by the convulsive heaving in the underlying strata. In many places, the extent of the disturbance was arrested by the deep chasms and corresponding elevations. We made but slow progress over these fragments of granite, mingled here and there with silicious quartz and alluvial deposits. When we came in sight of a vast plain covered in bones, it was like an immense cemetery, where the generations of 20 centuries mingled their dust. Piles of remains behind each other in the disturbance, undulating like sea toward the horizon, where they were lost in a soft haze. Here, on an extent of probably 3,000 square miles, was concentrated the whole history of animal life, the history scarcely traceable into the recent soil of the inhabited world. An insatiable curiosity urged us on. Our feet crushed the remains of the prehistoric animals and fossils, whose rare and interesting relics are eagerly competed for by a museum of great cities. The lives of 1,000 Cuviers would not suffice to reconstruct the skeleton that lie on this magnificent assemblage of organic remains. I was speechless with amazement. My uncle threw up his arms toward the impenetrable vault that stood for a sky, his mouth widely open, his eyes gleaming under his spectacles, his head moving up and down, left and right. His whole demeanor indicated how intense was his astonishment. He found himself in a priceless collection of Leptotherium, Mycotherium, Lithodon, Anolophion, Megatherium, Mastodon, Protheus, Pterodactyl, and all the antediluvian monsters gathered together for his private gratification. Just fancy an enthusiastic bibliomatic transported an instant into an Alexandrian library which Omar burned, and which some miracle had reduced from its ashes. Such was my uncle Lindenbrock at this moment. But there came a new phrase of astonishment. When hurrying across the organic dust, the seized a skull, and in a voice full of emotion, he cried, "Axel! Axel! A human head!" "A human head, uncle?" I said, equally surprised. "Yes, my lad. Ah, Milne Edwards. Ah, Quarterfages. Why are you not here with me to behold it?" Chapter 39. To understand why my uncle invoked these illustrations, savants, it should be understood that a fact of great importance in paleontology had been announced some time before we left. On March 28, 1836, some workmen, under the direction of Mr. Boucher de Parthis, excavating in quarries of Moulin Guigon near Abbeville, in the department of Somme in France, found a human jawbone 14 feet below the surface, and it was the first fossil of that kind ever brought to light. Near it, were found stone axes and cut flints, clothed by time with a uniform coating of green. This discovery made a great noise, not only in France, but in England and Germany. Many learned men of French Institute, among others, Messrs. Milne Edwards and Quarterfages, took up the matter warmly, proved the incontestable authenticity of the bone in question, and became an ardent partisans of the maxillary process. The learned men of the United Kingdom who accepted the fact as authentic, such as Messrs. Falconer, Busk, Carpenter, etc., were supported by the German savants, and foremost among these, the warmest enthusiast, was my uncle Lindenbrock. The authenticity of a human fossil of the fourth epoch was thus incontestably established and admitted. Their theory, it was true, and had an implacable opponent in Monsieur L. de Beaumont. This high authority held that the formation of Moulin Guigon did not belong to the Diluvium, but to a less remote stratum, and so far, in accordance with Cuvier, he denied the human race was contemporary with animals of the fourth epoch. My uncle Lindenbrock and the great majority of geologists had maintained the opposite by discussion and controversy, and Monsieur L. de Beaumont was almost left alone on the other side of the argument. All these details were familiar to us, but we were not aware of the progress which the question had made since our departure. Other jawbones, identical in species, though belonging to types and nations, had been found in the light soils of certain caves in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, as well as weapons, utensils, tools, bones of children, youths, men, and aged persons. The existence of man during the fourth epoch was daily confirmed. And this was not all. New remains, exhumed from the Pliocene, had been enabled bolder spirits to assign an antiquity even more remote to the human species. These remains, it is true, were not actually human, but relics of man's industry. Tibius and thigh bones of animals regularly striated, carved, so to speak, which told clearly of human work. Thus, at a bound, our species gained many steps on the ladder of time. He took precedence of the mastodon, and he became contemporary with Elephas meridionalis. He dated 100,000 years back, for that is the figure assigned by the best geologists to the Tertiary Pliocene. Such was the state of paleontological science, and the extent of our knowledge of it will account for our attitude as we gazed at this vast ossuary of the Sea of Lindenbrock, and also for the bewilderment of joy with which 20 paces farther my uncle found himself face to face with an individual man of the fourth epoch. It was perfectly recognizable human body, perhaps some peculiarly in the soil, and St. Michael's Cemetery in Bordeaux had thus preserved it. Who can tell? But this corpse, the skin tightened and dried like parchment, the limbs still so soft to all appearance, the teeth perfect, hair abundant, the finger and toenails of a hideous length, stood before us as in life. I was dumb before this apparition of another age. My uncle, generally so loquacious, so full of energetic talk, was silent too. He had lifted the corpse and set it straight. He looked at us from his hollow orbits. We handled his body and sounded at our touch. After some minutes of silence, the uncle was superseded by the professor. Otto Lindenbrock, carried away by his ardent temperament, forgot the circumstances of our voyage, the place we were in, the great cavern that held us. No doubt he fancied himself with the Johanarium standing before his pupils, for he took the lecturer's tone and addressing an imaginary audience, said, "Gentlemen, I have the honor to introduce you to a man of the fourth approach. Great savants have denied his existence. Others equally have maintained it. The St. Thomas of paleontology, were he here, would touch him with the finger, and I believe. I know how necessary it is for science to be on her guard against discoveries of this kind. I am aware of even contrivances of Barham and others of the same class to impose the world a fossil man. I know about the kneecap of Ajax and the pretended body of Orestes, discovered by the Spartans, and the body of Aristeus, 9 cubits long, of which Panusius tells. I have read the reports on the skeleton of Trapani, found in the 14th century, which it was sought to identify as Polyphemus, and as the history of the giant Dister near Palermo in the 16th century. You also, gentlemen, are acquainted with which the analysis made near Lucrine in 1577, of those gigantic bones which celebrated physician Felix Plater declared were those giant 19 feet high. I have read eagerly these treatises of Cassiano and all the memoirs, pamphlets, essays, and counter-essays published by apropos of the skeleton of the Cimbrian king Teutoburchus, an invader of Gaul, exhumed in a gravel pit in Dauphine in 1613. In the 18th century, I would have contested with Pierre Campet the existence of the pre-amatidates of Schuessler. I have in my hands a monograph called Gigan. Here was my uncle's natural infirmity. He could not in a public pronounce difficult words without stumbling. The monograph was called Gigan, he repeated. He got no farther. Giganto. No, the unfortunate word would stick there. How they would have laughed at him in Johannium. Gigantostology. At last he brought it out between the two imprecations. Then, more fluently than ever, he went on. Yes, gentlemen, all that is familiar to me. I am that the Cuvier and Bulumek see in these bones simply the remains of the mammoth and other animals of the fourth epoch. But here the doubt would be an insult to science. The body is there. You can see it. You can touch it. There is no skeleton. It is the perfect form, preserved for no purposes of anthropology. I had no desire to contravene this assertion. If I could wash it in a solution of sulfuric acid, I could free it from these earthly particles and glistening shells that encrust it. But the precious solvent is wanting. But, as he is, let him tell his story. Here the professor took the fossil corpse and handled it with the dexterity of a showman. You see, he said, it is not 6 feet long, far from giant proportions. As to the race it belongs to, can be no doubt it is Caucasian, the white race, the race to which we ourselves belong. The cranium of this fossil is ovoid, without projecting cheekbones or a protruding jaw. It presents no indications of procanivism, which modifies the facial angle. If we measure the angle, we can find almost 90 degrees. But I will go farther in my deductions. I will venture to assert this specimen of the human race is of the family of Japheth, which extends from India to the boundary of Eastern Europe. Do not smile, gentlemen. Nobody was smiling, but the professor was used to seeing faces relax during his learned dissertations. Yes, he continued with renewed energy, we have here a fossil man, a contemporary of the monsters who fill this vast amphitheater. As to how we came here, how the layers of debris in which he was embedded came into this vast cavern, I cannot offer a speculation. No one can doubt that, during the Quaternary epoch, there was a considerable disturbance of the Earth's crust. The gradual cooling of the globe produces gaps, chasms, faults, into which the portions of the upper stratum must fall. I assert nothing, but this much is certain. Here is the man surrounded by his handiwork. These axes, these wrought flints, which mark the Stone Age, and unless he came here as a tourist like myself, a pioneer of science, I cannot entertain a doubt of his origin. The professor was silent, and I uttered my unanimous applause. My uncle is perfectly right, and the wiser people than his nephew would have found it difficult to controvert his two true statements. Another point is that is not only the corpse in the great bed of bones, we met with each other at every step in the dust. And the uncle we had made of wonderful specimens, we were to convince unbelievers. In truth, it was an amazing sight to behold generations of men and animals in one mass confusion in this great cemetery. But here came an important question to which we had no solution. Were these beings already dust when, by some throw of nature, they were brought down by the shores of the Sea of Lindenbrock, or had they lived here in this subterranean world with this false sky and birth and death like the inhabitants of earth? Up to the present time we had only seen the sea monsters and fish alive. Were we yet to meet some man of the abyss wandering on this lonely shore? Chapter 40. For another half hour we wandered over these deposits of bones. We pressed on, impelled by immense curiosity. What other wonders would this cavern reveal? What new treasures for science? My eyes were on the watch for surprises, and my mind prepared for any degree of astonishment. The seashore had been long shut out by the hills formed by the ossuary. The imprudent professor, little dreaming of losing his way, drew me on to a distance. We went on silently, bathed in waves of electric light, by a phenomenon I cannot explain. The light seemed uniformly dispersed, not radiating from any center, nor casting any shade. It was as if we were in the summer noon of the equatorial region, under the vertical rays of the sun. All vapor had disappeared. The rocks, the distant mountains, confused outlines of distant forest, presented with singular aspect under the equally diffused light. We were like the fantastic creation of Hoffman, the man who lost his shadow. After walking about a mile, we found ourselves on the skirts of an immense forest, but not a fungoid growth like those we had seen in the neighborhood of Port Gräuben. It was the vegetation of the Quaternary epoch in all its magnificence. The great palms of the species now extinct, superb palmacites, yews, cypresses, thujas, represented the conifers, and we were interlaced with impenetrable network of lianas. The ground was thickly carpeted with mosses and hepaticas. Some small streams trickled through the groves, scarce worthy of the name, as they gave no shade. At the sides of the streams grew tree ferns, like those of our hothouses, but color was wanting to trees like shrubs alike, debarred from the vivifying light of the sun. Everything was a uniform brown or faded tint. The leaves had no greenness, and the flowers themselves so numerous that The approach, now colorless and scentless, looked as if made of paper and discolored by their action of the air. My uncle ventured into this gigantic labyrinth. I followed, without apprehension. This nature had spread a vegetable banquet. Why should we not meet with some of the terrible mammifers? And some openings left by decayed and fallen trees, I saw leguminous plants and acres from rubias and 1,000 other shrubs dear to the ruminants of all ages. Then, blended in one group, I beheld the trees of dissimilar climates. The oak growing beside the palm, the eucalyptus of Australia elbowing the Norwegian pine, the birch of the north mingling with its branches with the kauri of New Zealand. It was a puzzle, the most scientific botanist of the upper earth. Suddenly, I came to a stop. I held back my uncle. The diffused light made the smallest objects visible in the depths of the forest. I thought I saw... No! My eyes did not deceive me. Did I see immense forms moving under the trees? They were giant mammals, a herd of mastodons, not fossil, but living, of the kind whose remains were discovered in 1801 in the swamps of Ohio River. I distinctly saw great elephants, whose trunks were coiling among branches like a legion of serpents. I could hear the noise of their ivory tusks as they struck the bark of their trees. The branches cracked, and the leaves, torn off in masses, dispersed down the mighty throats of these monsters. The dream in which I seemed to received that prehistoric wood, the fourth and third approach. That dream was realized. My uncle looked. "Come," he said, seizing my arm. "Come on, we will go on." "No," I said. "No, we are unarmed. What could we do in the midst of a herd of giant quadrupeds? Come, uncle, come. No creature could have braved the fury of those monsters. No human creature," said my uncle in a subdued voice. "You are wrong, Axel. Look down there. I think I see a human form, like a being like ourselves. A man." I shrugged my shoulders while I looked, and resolved not to believe it unless belief was inevitable. But, in spite of myself, I was convinced. About a quarter mile off, leaning against the branch of an enormous kauri pine, a human being, a Proteus of these subterranean regions, the new son of Neptune, was herding that vast troop of mastodons. Enamus pectoris custos, imori espe. Yes, imori espe, it was no longer the fossil being whose corpse was picked up on the ossuary. It was living giant capable of commanding these monsters. This statue was over 12 feet. His head, as large as that of a buffalo, was lost in the mass of his tangled hair. It was a mane like that of a primeval elephant. He bandaged an enormous limb of a tree, a crook would for much a shepherd. We stood motionless, petrified, but we ran the risk of being seen. We must fly. "Come, come!" I cried, dragging my uncle, who, for the first time in his life, allowed himself to be led. A quarter of an hour after we were out of sight and this formidable enemy. Now that I think of all quietly, now that my mind is calm again, and that the months have elapsed since the wonderful supernatural apparition, what am I to think? What am I to believe? It seems impossible. Our senses must have played us false. Our eyes did not see what they showed us. No human creature lives in this subterranean world. No generation of men inhabits those lower caverns of the globe without an era of the inhabitants above. And without communication with them, it is madness. The height of madness. I would rather admit the existence of some animal whose structure approximates to ours, some ape of a remote geological period, some Prothecus, some Mesopithecus, like that which Lartet discovered in the bone deposit of Sansal. But this one which we saw exceeded in size of all species known in modern paleontology. No matter, we can imagine the ape, however improbable, but a whole generation of living men, shut up in the bowels of the earth. I can never believe it. However, we left the light and luminous forest dumb in astonishment. Overcome by stupefaction and bordered on insensibility, we ran mechanically. It was a mad flight, an irresistible impulse, but such as pervades some kind of nightmare. Instinctively, we returned to the sea of Linden Rock. I do not know into what vagaries my reason might have been betrayed, but I was forcibly recalled to the practical matters. Although I was certain that we were treading virgin ground, I frequently noticed the grounds of rock that had recalled me to those of Port Gräuben. This was further confirmation of indication of compass, and our involuntary return to the north of the Sea of Linden Rock. It was sometimes very confusing. Hundreds of hills and cascades fell from the crags. I seemed to recognize the sanct stratum of Surtur Brand, our faithful Hansbach, and the grotto where we first regained my senses. Then again, at the little distance lay the rocky sea wall. The appearance of a streamlet, a striking outline of a rock, threw me into the state of indecision as to our whereabouts. I impaired my doubts to my uncle. He, too, was in a maze. In a panorama so vast and so monotonous, there was nothing in the mind could fix it as a landmark. At any rate, I said, we have not landed at our point of embarkation. The storm has let us lower down, if we follow the shore, we shall come to Port Gräuben. If that is so, said my uncle, we need explore no further. The best thing we can do is go back to the raft. Are you sure you were correct, Axel? That is difficult to say positively, uncle. All the rocks are alike, and yet I fancy I recognize that the promontory who's at the foot of Hans put our raft together. We ought to be near the little port, unless, indeed, this is it. I added, scrutinizing the small creek. No, Axel, if that were so, we should find our own tracks, and I see nothing of the kind. But I see, I said, darting towards something shown in the sand. What is it? Look, I said, and I showed my uncle the dagger stained with rust which I had picked up. Steady now, he said. Did you bring this weapon with you? No, indeed, but you... Not to my knowledge, replied the professor. I never had such a thing in my possession. How strange. Well, no, after all, it is simple enough, Axel. The Icelanders often have poniards of this kind. Hans must have dropped this one, no doubt of his. I shook my head. Hans had never had anything of this kind. It is a weapon, I cried. Some of an antediluvian warrior, of a living man, a contemporary of the giant herdsman? But no, it does not belong to a stone age, nor the age of bronze either. This blade is steel. My uncle stopped me short in this new digression. In this cold tone he said, Calm yourself, Axel, and collect your wits. This poniard weapon is of the 16th century. A true dagger, such as noblemen used to carry in their belt to give the coup de grace. It belongs neither to you, nor me, nor the hunter, nor even the human beings who may live in the bowels of the earth. Would you venture to say, see? That notch never came from cutting throats. The blade is covered with rust that dates not from day, nor year, nor an age. The professor grew warm. As usual, we have gave the reins to his imagination. Axel, he said, we are on the road of a great discovery. This blade has lain on one sand now, 2, perhaps, 300 years that the notch was made by the rocks of this subterranean sea. But, I said, it did not come here by itself. It did not give itself a twist. Someone has been here before us. Yes, a man. And this man has graven his name in the dagger. He wanted to mark once more the road to the central point. Let us search some everywhere. Intensely interested, we kept close along the high wall, prying to the narrowest crevices and looked the entrance of the gallery. We at last came to the place where the shore narrowed. The sea almost washed the foot of the cliff, leaving the passage not more than 6 feet wide. Two projecting points of the rocks, we saw the entrance to a dark tunnel. There, on a block of granite, stood the mysterious letters, half effaced, the initials of the bold traveler. A.S., cried my uncle. Arn Secnusum! Always Arn Secnusum!